The wind was a harsh, biting presence against my skin, carrying the sharp tang of the city as I huddled alone on a derelict wooden bench outside the imposing facade of the bank. My hands were clamped around my phone with such desperate intensity that the tips of my fingers had turned white, a physical manifestation of the tension constricting my chest. I forced my trembling fingers to navigate the screen, attempting to call him again, a futile, raw plea echoing in the silent spaces of my heart. But the response was the same, an impersonal, chillingly detached mechanical voice, delivering a verdict far crueler than any shouted accusation. "This number has been blocked." I lowered the phone slowly, my gaze fixed on the stark reality displayed on the screen. The small, unforgiving words. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat that seemed to drown out the cacophony of urban life swirling around me. The blare of horns, the distant siren, the murmur of countless conversations. Brian, my only son, the boy I had poured my entire being into, the pride that had swelled my chest with every small achievement, the singular purpose that had anchored my existence for decades. He had erased me, severed the connection, with the casual indifference of a digital click. A deep, insidious hollowness began to spread through my chest, a chilling vacuum that felt both vast and suffocating. It was a sharp, internal silence, a void I knew, with terrifying certainty, I couldn't outrun. The city outside the bubble of my despair continued its relentless forward motion. People streamed past, their arms laden with vibrant shopping bags, their faces alight with purpose or simple preoccupation. Children's laughter drifted on the wind, sharp and bright, a stark contrast to the leaden weight in my soul. Cars honked impatiently, buses rumbled past, a world alive and indifferent. For them, nothing had changed. But for me, in that single, devastating moment, everything had stopped. I remained frozen on that cracked bench, a statue of grief and bewilderment, my mind wrestling with the unimaginable question, how had it come to this? How could a love so meticulously woven, so tenderly nurtured over decades of shared laughter and quiet sacrifices, be so casually, so brutally discarded? A lone tear traced a path down my cheek, cold against the sudden heat of my skin. I wiped it away with the worn sleeve of my sweater, a small, instinctive gesture of self-preservation. In that moment of profound stillness, a spark ignited somewhere deep within me, a tiny, defiant ember refusing to be extinguished by the flood of pain. I knew one undeniable truth: I could not stay here, crumbling into dust on this bench. Not today. Not for him. The fight, though I didn't know its form yet, was not over. Before this crushing unraveling, my life had possessed a comforting simplicity. It wasn't a life painted with the broad strokes of perfection or the glittering hues of glamour, but it was fundamentally warm, a patchwork of small, reliable certainties that enveloped me like a cherished, well-worn quilt. My address had remained unchanged for decades. I still resided in the same modest house that my late husband, Tom, and I had purchased when we were young, full of shared dreams and quiet plans. After Tom passed, the rhythm of our household shifted, becoming solely Brian and me. It would be dishonest to say it was easy. Raising a lively boy alone while juggling the demands of a full-time job as a school secretary stretched my limits, physically, emotionally, and financially. But the thought of giving up, of succumbing to the challenges, never once crossed my mind. Every morning began with packing Brian's lunch, a small brown bag often containing a handwritten note tucked amidst the sandwich and apple, a tangible piece of my love sent with him into his day. I became a fixture at every baseball game, cheering with genuine enthusiasm, even when the intricacies of the rules remained a delightful mystery to me. Late into the evenings, I would meticulously stitch Halloween costumes by hand, pouring hours of effort into crafting unique creations because the store-bought alternatives felt too impersonal, too devoid of the love woven into each seam. Money was a constant tightrope walk. I became a master of making do, learning to stretch every dollar until it felt transparent. Clipping coupons wasn't a hobby. It was a religious practice. Vacations were a luxury I willingly skipped. Buying second-hand clothes was done without complaint, a practical necessity rather than a source of shame. Every time I managed to scrape together a few extra dollars to deposit into my modest savings account, I wasn't just seeing numbers on a passbook. I was visualizing the foundation of a future, a secure landing place for both of us. That money wasn't merely currency. It represented years of birthdays missed because I was working overtime to make ends meet, of skipped dinners out, of countless quiet sacrifices made in the solitude of my heart that no one else ever saw, or perhaps ever truly appreciated. It was the physical manifestation of my unwavering devotion. Brian grew up immersed in the undeniable knowledge that he was loved, fiercely and unconditionally. It was the bedrock upon which I built his world. He had a sturdy roof over his head, the comforting predictability of a home-cooked meal laid out on the table every single night, and a mother whose love was a force of nature, capable of moving mountains for his well-being if the need ever arose. He was a bright child, quick-witted and full of an infectious energy that bubbled just beneath the surface. I remember the surge of pride, so potent it felt like a physical force, watching him walk across that stage in his cap and gown on graduation day. He wasn't the most academically driven student, perhaps, but he possessed a burning ambition, a hunger for success that I deeply admired. Yet, even amidst that admiration, a quiet worry often settled in my heart, a fear that he might be chasing his dreams too fast, too recklessly, potentially losing himself in the pursuit. After high school, his path wasn't linear. He bounced from one grand dream to the next with the restless energy of youth. First, it was the glittering promise of a tech startup, then the tangible world of real estate, followed by the volatile, fast-paced realm of cryptocurrency investments. He spoke of each venture with such captivating passion, such absolute certainty in his inevitable success, that it was easy, wonderfully easy to believe that he was perpetually on the cusp of greatness. I didn't always grasp the complexities of the world he was attempting to conquer, the intricate language of venture capital or blockchain technology. But I believed in him. More profoundly, I believed in us, in the enduring strength of the bond that had been forged over years of shared laughter, whispered fears, and countless quiet sacrifices. It was a bond I considered unbreakable. Retirement. The word itself held the promise of a golden chapter, a serene unfolding of years earned through decades of relentless work and unwavering dedication. I had painted the picture in my mind with vivid, hopeful colors, long, unhurried walks through the sun-dappled pathways of the local park, the quiet satisfaction of volunteering at the library, surrounded by the comforting scent of old books, perhaps even the adventurous possibility of a little travel destinations I had only ever visited within the glossy pages of magazines. But most vividly, most lovingly, I imagined having Brian close again, his life intertwined with mine once more. I pictured him potentially bringing a wife into our world, the joyful chaos of grandchildren filling the quiet corners of the house, Sunday dinners gathered around the familiar, old oak table that had witnessed so much of our lives. I saw family photos multiplying on the staircase wall, each one a testament to a life rich in connection, the house finally echoing with the vibrant sounds of laughter rather than the pervasive, growing silence I had come to dread. Never, not for a single moment, did I doubt that the years of scraping by, of meticulously saving every possible dollar, every sacrifice, had been anything less than entirely worth it. I had built that future brick by painstaking brick dollar by dollar, often through heartache and exhaustion. The idea of sharing the fruits of that lifetime of labor with Brian, of providing him with the financial launch pad he needed to truly launch his business, to give him a genuine shot at the kind of success he so desperately craved, felt like the natural, inevitable extension of everything I had spent my life working toward. When Brian first tentatively floated the idea of needing some financial assistance, my hesitation was fleeting, barely a ripple on the surface of my readiness to help. Of course, I would help. What else? I reasoned. Was all of this hard-won security, this lifetime of careful planning, truly for? If not for him, I didn't perceive it as a cold, transactional loan with rigid terms and expected repayments. Instead, I viewed it as a sacred investment, an investment in his boundless potential, in his future, and most importantly, in our future, together, as a family. I pictured him flourishing, his ventures soaring, achieving the success he dreamed of, and eventually, I saw him turning back to me, perhaps with a smile and a warm embrace that would, in an instant, make every lonely holiday spent working, every unpaid overtime hour logged, every empty birthday felt alone, feel profoundly, unequivocally worth it. The night before I made the final, irreversible transfer of my retirement savings, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table. It was the very same table Tom and I had picked out together all those years ago, back when Brian was just a baby, his tiny hands reaching for ours across its worn surface. I spent hours poring over old photo albums, each page a portal to cherished memories. There was Brian, beaming with proud innocence in his oversized Little League uniform, his knees perpetually scraped. Brian, clutching a science fair trophy with a mix of triumph and bashfulness. Brian, wrapping his small arms tightly around my neck on countless Christmas mornings, his face buried in my sweater. Each photograph was more than just a captured moment. It felt like a promise, a vibrant reminder of everything we had navigated, survived, and celebrated together. The next day, as I sat in the hushed quiet of the bank, signing the necessary paperwork to move the funds, I felt a nervous flutter in my stomach. Yes, but it was overshadowed by a powerful wave of hope. I imagined Brian finally stepping into the man I had always known he could be, fulfilling the potential I saw, shining so brightly within him. I pictured myself sitting proudly in the front row of his success story, clapping louder than anyone else, my heart overflowing. Without a second thought, without a moment of genuine doubt, I handed over the entirety of my retirement savings. It wasn't, I told myself, because I was naive, blind to the realities of the world. It wasn't because I was careless with the precious security I had built. It was simply because I loved him, with a depth and intensity that had defined my existence, and for the vast majority of my life. Love, in its purest form, had always felt like enough, or so, in my deepest heart. I believed the first inkling, the initial subtle sign that something was fundamentally wrong, came so quietly, so unobtrusively, that I almost entirely missed it. It was a Saturday morning, crisp and clear, the kind of day that usually promised a gentle unfolding. Brian dropped by the house, unannounced but not entirely unexpectedly. He still possessed a key, a remnant of his childhood, a symbol I cherished. And even though his visits had become increasingly infrequent in recent months, I had diligently convinced myself that he was simply caught in the whirlwind of building his burgeoning career, too busy to spare more than a fleeting moment. He didn't bother with the formality of knocking, simply letting himself in, a habit from youth that now felt strangely jarring. He was dressed in clothes that spoke of a world far removed from my own, a tailored jacket that looked impossibly expensive, pristine, new sneakers that likely cost more than my entire monthly grocery budget. He offered barely a glance in my direction before flopping down at the familiar kitchen table, his attention immediately captured by the glowing screen of his phone, scrolling through some invisible stream of information with an almost compulsive intensity. I moved through the familiar motions of making coffee, brewing it exactly the way he used to prefer it when he lived here. 2 sugars, no cream, and slid a steaming mug in front of him. He mumbled a perfunctory "thanks," his eyes remaining fixed on his device, the gesture devoid of warmth or true acknowledgement. For a stretched moment, we sat in silence, the only sound the soft clinking of the spoon against the mug and the occasional, intrusive buzz or ping from his phone. I attempted to bridge the growing chasm between us, trying to fill the awkward space by asking about his latest venture. The last I had heard, he was collaborating with a friend on launching some kind of revolutionary app, something he claimed would change the way people invested. Brian offered a dismissive shrug, his gaze still glued to the screen. "It's going all right," he said, the words flat, lacking the usual spark of his ambition. "But you know how it is. You need real money to make real money." I managed a small, weak smile and nodded, pretending to understand the financial intricacies he spoke of, even though the terms felt foreign and abstract. More than anything, I was just happy to have him here, to feel the house briefly alive with his presence again, to pretend for a moment that things were as they once were. Then he laughed, a dry, humorless sound that held a sharp edge of bitterness I didn't recognize. "You know, Mom," he said, finally looking up, his eyes meeting mine but holding a strange, unsettling detachment. "People your age just let money rot in banks. You should be doing something with it. It's dead money otherwise. I blinked, the unexpected words hitting me with the physical force of small stones sinking into my chest. I forced a laugh, a strained, awkward sound, desperately hoping he was merely joking. Perhaps making a clumsy attempt at a provocative observation. I tried to play along, joking back that I preferred my money safe and boring. Much like myself, I added with a self-deprecating smile. But Brian didn't smile in return. He just shook his head, a subtle gesture of impatience and dismissal, and muttered, "Yeah, well, boring doesn't build empires." His words remained with me long after he had departed, a persistent, unwelcome echo in the suddenly too quiet house. They circled my mind with the relentless determination of birds searching for a place to land, refusing to settle. It wasn't precisely what he had said. Brian had always possessed a bold, audacious spirit, a tendency towards grand declarations and ambitious pronouncements. He was, after all, a dreamer. It was the way he had said it, the casual dismissal in his tone, the coldness in his eyes, the subtle implication that he viewed me not as his mother, the source of his existence and endless support, but merely as a gatekeeper to something he wanted, something he felt entitled to. That night, after finishing the mundane task of washing the few dishes left from our awkward interaction, I found myself standing at the kitchen window, staring out into the impenetrable darkness of the backyard. The house, which had always felt like a warm, protective embrace, suddenly felt too large, too empty. The silence within its walls no longer comforting, but heavy, pressing against me, suffocating. I thought about the countless years I had dedicated to saving, the small, daily denials skipping new shoes, even when mine were worn thin, ignoring crumbling kitchen cabinets that desperately needed replacing, patching up the leaky roof myself when we simply couldn't afford professional repairs. I thought about every Christmas where, instead of buying something small for myself, I had carefully tucked a few extra dollars into the savings account, prioritizing the future over momentary gratification. I hadn't been hoarding money out of stinginess or fear. I had been protecting our future, building a shield against uncertainty, ensuring a foundation for both of us. And now, suddenly, that lifetime of careful planning, that symbol of security and sacrifice, was reduced to dead money. I tried to shake off the feeling, to rationalize his words away. Perhaps I was overreacting, I told myself fiercely. Brian was under immense pressure, trying to navigate the treacherous waters of starting a business. It was stressful, and he was merely venting. A moment of thoughtless frustration directed at the easiest target. I repeated these justifications like a mantra, forcing myself to believe them because the alternative, the terrifying possibility that he saw me not as a steadfast support system, but as an obstacle, a relic of a bygone era hindering his progress, was simply too painful to accept, too devastating to contemplate. Over the subsequent weeks and months, each time we spoke or interacted, little things began to accumulate, small pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. He canceled dinner plans at the last minute with increasingly flimsy excuses, always citing meetings with investors that couldn't be rescheduled. He forgot my birthday, a first in his life. A small oversight, perhaps, but one that felt disproportionately significant. And when I gently reminded him, He laughed it off, a brittle, unsettling sound, claiming he was simply too busy making moves. Each of these moments, taken in isolation, was small enough to explain away, to attribute to the pressures of his ambitious life. Each cut was shallow enough to ignore, a minor sting that I could pretend didn't pierce the surface. But somewhere, deep beneath the layers of hope and denial I had constructed, a quiet, persistent unease began to grow. It was a small voice, whispering with relentless clarity, suggesting that the son I had raised, the boy I had fed, clothed, loved with every fiber of my being, and believed in with unwavering faith, was slowly, irrevocably slipping away, transforming into someone I didn't fully recognize, someone colder, more distant. Still, I clung desperately to the cherished memories, the anchors to the past, the late-night study sessions where I helped him cram for exams, the countless scraped knees I had kissed better with a mother's magic, the whispered promises he had made as a child that he would always take care of me one day, just as I had taken care of him. Love. I told myself repeatedly, demanded patience. It demanded trust, an unwavering belief in the inherent goodness of the person you cherished. And so, with a determination born of desperation, I buried the growing pile of red flags beneath a mountain of hope. I kept on believing, because believing in Brian, believing in us, was all I knew how to do. The distance between us wasn't a sudden, dramatic chasm that opened overnight. It was a slow, insidious process, like water seeping into the foundation of a house, invisible at first, a silent infiltration, but eventually becoming impossible to ignore, threatening the very structure of everything built upon it. After that unsettling morning in the kitchen, Brian's visits dwindled, becoming increasingly sporadic. Days stretched into weeks without a single word, the silence growing heavy and suffocating. When I attempted to reach him by phone, he answered with hurried voices, always claiming to be in the middle of something urgent, perpetually on the cusp of a crucial deal or a groundbreaking meeting. Conversations that had once flowed with natural ease, filled with shared stories and comfortable silences, were now clipped. Mechanical exchanges. He was always about to jump on a call or running into a meeting, his attention clearly elsewhere, his impatience palpable. He barely asked about me anymore, not about my health, my day, the small, everyday details that had once been the fabric of our connection. At first, I instinctively blamed myself. Perhaps I was bothering him too much, I thought. Maybe I was being too needy, clinging to a past he had already moved beyond. I tried to give him space, to resist the urge to call, waiting patiently for him to initiate contact, to show me I still mattered. But the phone remained stubbornly silent, and with each passing, empty day, the silence grew heavier, a tangible weight pressing down on my heart. One Sunday, in a desperate attempt to reconnect, I baked his favorite pecan pie, the one with the flaky crust and perfectly spiced filling that he had loved since childhood. I sent him a simple message. Made your favorite. Would love to see you if you're free. Hours passed. No reply. I tried again the next morning. A tentative text. Still nothing. 3 long, agonizing days later, a text finally arrived. Been slammed. Maybe next week. No apology for the delay. No warmth. just cold, transactional words devoid of any genuine connection. I left the pie untouched on the kitchen counter, its sweet aroma a cruel reminder of my futile efforts. It sat there, slowly spoiling, until I finally, reluctantly, forced myself to throw it away, a small, bitter act of discarding a wasted gesture of love. When he did visit, perhaps once a month if I was lucky, he was palpably different, restless, perpetually distracted. His eyes were constantly scanning his phone screen, even mid-conversation. He would nod absently while I spoke, offering non-committal sounds, never truly hearing the words I was saying, never truly seeing me. Sometimes, I would catch him glancing at the clock, a furtive, almost guilty movement, as if counting the minutes until he could escape my company. The boy who had once begged me to stay up late and watch movies with him, snuggled together on the couch, now seemed eager to flee my presence, his impatience a constant, subtle irritant. It wasn't just the indifference that chipped away at me. It was the tiny slights, the small, almost imperceptible dismissals that accumulated, each one wearing down my spirit. When I mentioned a book I had recently read, eager to share a piece of my world, he would wave it off with a condescending smile, saying, "Mom, nobody reads anymore." When I tried to offer advice, rooted in decades of life experience, old habits die hard, you know. I might say, he would offer a thin, patronizing smile and respond, "You wouldn't understand how things work now." Each comment, each gesture, felt like a paper cut across a heart already worn thin by worry and neglect. Tiny, almost invisible wounds that, cumulatively, bled just the same. The home that had once felt alive with the vibrant sounds of laughter, conversation, and shared moments now echoed with a pervasive, unsettling quiet. I spent more and more evenings alone at the kitchen table, the sound of my fork scraping against a plate in a house too big for one person, a constant, lonely soundtrack. I would catch myself staring at the empty chair across from me, vividly remembering all the nights Brian had sat there, animatedly talking about school, about his friends, about his ever-shifting dreams for the future. Where? I wondered with a silent ache. Had that boy gone? Still? I continued to make excuses for his behavior, constructing elaborate justifications in my mind. Perhaps he was just incredibly stressed, burdened by the weight of his entrepreneurial aspirations. Maybe he was ashamed that he hadn't yet made it in the spectacular way he had envisioned, and he simply didn't want to face me, the source of his unwavering belief, until he had something tangible to brag about. I clung to these explanations with a desperate ferocity, determined to shield myself from the growing, gnawing feeling that our bond, the one I had considered unbreakable, was fraying beyond repair. One afternoon, driven by a desperate need to see him, to break through the silence, I dropped by his apartment without warning, something I never would have done in the past. Respecting his independence, I carried a small bag of groceries, just a few simple things I thought he might need: his favorite soup, some fresh fruit, a tin of homemade cookies. I stood outside his door for a long time, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation, debating whether to knock, whether I was crossing an invisible line. When he finally opened the door, the look on his face wasn't one of joy or surprise. It was unmistakable irritation, a flash of annoyance that pierced me more deeply than any angry word. "You can't just show up! Mom, I'm really busy." My apology spilled out, clumsy and automatic, making me feel instantly foolish, an unwelcome intruder. I held out the small bag of groceries, a pathetic offering. "Just a few things," I mumbled. "Thought you might be low on groceries." He took the bag with a forced smile, a perfunctory gesture, barely glancing inside. He thanked me with a distracted pat on the shoulder, a touch so impersonal it felt colder than the air outside, and reiterated that he had to get back to work. I stood there in the hallway, clutching my purse, feeling utterly lost, like an intruder in the very life I had poured my heart and soul into building. When I got back to my car, I sat behind the wheel for a long time, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, mirroring the ache in my chest. It wasn't just that he didn't seem to have time for me anymore. It was the devastating realization that he didn't seem to want time with me. I drove home that day in a heavy silence, the radio off, the familiar road blurring past me through a haze of unshed tears. Somewhere deep inside, in that quiet space where raw truth resides, I realized that the boy who used to run into my arms when he scraped his knee, seeking comfort and reassurance, the young man who had promised with innocent sincerity that he would always take care of me one day, just as I had cared for him, he was slipping further and further away. And I didn't know, not for the life of me, how to stop it. It was a Saturday afternoon when the humiliation finally sank its sharp teeth into me, leaving a mark that would linger long after the immediate sting faded. Margot, my oldest and dearest friend, had invited me to a small, informal gathering at her house. Nothing elaborate, just a relaxed lunch with a few close friends and family members to celebrate her daughter's recent engagement. I had almost not gone. Brian had promised he would stop by that morning to help me fix a leaky faucet. A minor chore, but one I had looked forward to simply because it meant seeing him. But when I called to confirm, he didn't answer. I waited for 2 agonizing hours, the minutes ticking by with cruel slowness, my embarrassment mounting with each passing moment, before finally conceding defeat and forcing myself to leave for Margot's. When I arrived, Margot's backyard was a scene of warmth and conviviality, filled with the sounds of laughter, the gentle clinking of glasses, and the inviting aroma of barbecue drifting from the grill. I navigated my way through the small crowd, offering forced smiles and exchanging pleasantries with familiar faces, my heart heavy with disappointment and the lingering sting of Brian's absence. Then, unexpectedly, I saw him. He was standing in a tight circle with a group of younger men I didn't recognize, laughing, holding a bottle of beer. My heart, against my better judgment, lifted instinctively. Maybe, just maybe, he had come after all. Maybe today would be different. Maybe he would see me and our connection would instantly bridge the distance that had grown between us. I approached the group tentatively, my hand raised in a small, hopeful wave. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, my voice perhaps a little too bright, a little too eager. Brian turned, and his eyes met mine for a moment that stretched into an eternity. A blank, almost annoyed expression flickered across his face, quickly replaced by a wide, artificial smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, guys," "This is my mom," he said, his voice unnaturally loud, thick with a forced, performative humor. "She's still figuring out how the internet works." The group chuckled, a light, casual sound, but one that struck me with the force of a physical blow, stinging like a slap across the face. I froze, my hand still awkwardly half-raised in greeting. I tried to laugh too, a desperate attempt to appear in on the joke, to pretend his words didn't cut me to the core. But the sound that escaped my throat was strangled and wrong. One of the men clapped Brian on the back and said something about old school folks and dead investments. Words I only half caught but understood were neither kind nor respectful. I stood there for another agonizing moment, my face burning with humiliation, the heat radiating from my cheeks. No one in the group made a move to include me. No one asked me to stay. Brian had already turned his attention back to his friends, caught up in another burst of laughter at something else entirely, effectively erasing my presence. I slipped away quietly, melting back into the crowd, weaving through the cheerful clusters of people until I found a secluded spot near the back fence. Partially hidden by a large shrub, I pretended to be absorbed in checking my phone, staring blankly at the dark screen until the hot, stinging tears that had threatened to spill, finally, slowly receded, pushed back by sheer force of will. I didn't want anyone, especially Brian, to witness my pain, to see how deeply his casual cruelty had wounded me. Margot found me a few minutes later. She didn't need words. Her eyes, filled with a quiet understanding, met mine, and she simply reached out and squeezed my hand, a gesture of silent solidarity. It should have offered comfort, a sense of being seen and understood. But instead, it only deepened the shame that was curling like a tight, hot knot in the pit of my stomach. For the remainder of the afternoon, I went through the motions, forcing smiles, making polite small talk, my body present but my heart miles away, trapped in the echo of Brian's words. I watched him from a distance, moving effortlessly among the guests, laughing, charming, seemingly completely free from the burden of my presence. I felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that used to be intrinsically linked to mine, standing on the outside looking in. Later that evening, as the sun began its slow descent towards the horizon and people started gathering their belongings to say their goodbyes, Brian approached me. He offered a quick hug, the kind you give a distant acquaintance or a relative you barely know. A perfunctory embrace, utterly devoid of the warmth and familiarity that had once characterized our physical connection. He mumbled something vague about catching up soon, his eyes avoiding mine, a clear signal that the promise was empty. I nodded, pretending not to notice the deliberate evasion, the polite dismissal. Driving home, the scene replayed itself over and over in my mind, a relentless loop of painful images and sounds. Each laugh directed at me, each dismissive glance, each wordless gesture of being cast aside. They formed a jagged mosaic of where I now stood in Brian's life. I wasn't his mother anymore, not in any meaningful sense. I was a relic of a past he seemed eager to leave behind, an obligation to be tolerated, a subject for a casual joke, and then, most painfully, something to be forgotten, at home. I sank into the familiar comfort of the old armchair in the living room, the one Brian used to crawl into beside me when he was small, snuggling against my side, secure in my presence. I traced the worn fabric of the armrest with my fingertips, remembering the countless nights he had fallen asleep in my lap, his small body a warm weight against mine, trusting me implicitly to keep him safe, to protect him from the world. Somewhere along the way, that innocent, absolute trust had been replaced by something colder, harder, contempt. And the worst, most painful part was the dawning realization that I had allowed it to happen, inch by slow inch, moment by quiet moment, because I had been too blinded by love, by my desperate need to believe in the boy he once was, to see the painful truth unfolding before my eyes. That night, sitting alone in the quiet house, I didn't cry. The tears seemed to have dried up, replaced by a vast, aching emptiness. I sat perfectly still, staring into the darkness, feeling the slow, agonizing unraveling of something that had once felt utterly unbreakable. Love. I finally understood with a shattering clarity. Wasn't enough anymore. And for the first time, in the deepest, most terrifying core of my being, I wasn't sure it ever truly had been. The final, definitive break wasn't marked by shouting matches or the dramatic slamming of doors, the kind of explosive confrontation that signals an undeniable end. It happened the way most profound heartbreaks do, quietly, subtly, in the small, heavy moments where the stark, undeniable truth sinks in. The devastating realization that you are no longer wanted, no longer a necessary part of someone's life. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon, the sky a dull, oppressive gray, when Brian called. My heart, despite everything, still performed its ridiculous automatic leap when I saw his name flash across the screen. A residual reflex after so many months of being ignored, pushed aside, and deliberately kept at a distance. I answered on the second ring, forcing my voice to sound casual, attempting to hide the faint flicker of hope and desperate excitement that still stubbornly resided within me. "Hey, Mom," he said, his tone clipped, businesslike, devoid of any warmth, immediately extinguishing that fragile spark of hope. "I was thinking about the money you said you were saving. Your retirement fund." I felt my stomach clench, a sudden, sickening tightening. We had spoken about my nest egg before, but only in vague, abstract terms. The security I had spent decades building. The fund that represented my future independence, my carefully constructed safety net. But I had always kept it separate, sacred, untouchable. It wasn't just money. It was the tangible manifestation of safety, of freedom from worry, a lifetime's worth of tiny, unacknowledged sacrifices stacked one on top of the other. "I was thinking," Brian continued, oblivious to the turmoil his words were creating within me. "It's just sitting there doing nothing. Meanwhile, I'm trying to grow my business, and every day that passes, we lose opportunities. He said it, the word hanging in the air, as if the years I had spent patching roofs, skipping meals, saying a quiet no to every small luxury were a shared burden, a collective effort towards our success. I just need a little bit," he pressed, his voice taking on a practiced earnestness, "to really push this to the next level. A loan. You'll get it back. Plus interest." I hesitated, a tiny, protective voice of instinct screaming at me to slow down, to ask questions, to put up a boundary. But then, Brian's voice softened, shifting into that familiar, boyish, earnest tone. The one he had used as a child to get his way. The one I hadn't heard in so long. "Come on, Mom. Trust me. You always believed in me. Just one more time." How could I say no to that? How could I refuse the son I had spent a lifetime lifting up, supporting, believing in against all odds? The carefully constructed walls of my resolve crumbled. I told him I would think about it, the words feeling weak and inadequate even as I spoke them. That night, sleep was a distant, unattainable luxury. I sat at the kitchen table, the numbers on my bank statements blurring together through a haze of exhaustion and anxiety. I thought about the future I had so carefully imagined, the quiet retirement free from the relentless pressures of making ends meet, the hard-won freedom from financial worry. And then I thought about Brian, full of youthful hope and boundless ambition, standing, in his mind at least, on the edge of something he believed was great, a future filled with success and recognition. By morning, after a long, silent wrestling match with myself, I had made my decision. I called the bank, my voice a little shaky, and arranged the transfer. I told myself, clung to the desperate hope that it wasn't giving up my future. It was securing it, and surely, I reasoned, that was worth more than any personal safety net I could construct. I texted Brian to let him know the money was on the way, a simple message confirming the transfer. He responded almost instantly, a brief, digital echo of his earlier words. "Thanks, Mom. You won't regret this." Those 5 words, devoid of any personal connection or emotional depth, were the last I heard from him for a very, very long time. In the immediate aftermath, I did what I had always done. I made excuses. Perhaps he was incredibly busy, swamped by the demands of launching his business. Maybe it was taking off faster than he expected, requiring his complete focus. I told myself he would call soon, would stop by, would show up one day with a bouquet of flowers and that wide, familiar grin, saying, "We did it. Mom, all that sacrifice was worth it." But the days stretched into weeks, then into months, each passing day a silent, heavy burden. Every time I called, the line went straight to voicemail, his recorded greeting a cruel reminder of the barrier between us. My messages, both texts and emails, sat unread, unanswered. Driven by a desperate need for information, for any sign of his well-being or the progress of his venture, I checked his social media, something I had never truly understood how to use, navigating the unfamiliar platforms with clumsy fingers. I saw pictures of him at parties, on trips to glamorous locations, posing next to flashy cars that looked nothing like the image of the struggling entrepreneur he had presented to me. The slow, painful realization dawned upon me, settling deep in my bones like a terminal illness. He wasn't busy. He wasn't struggling. He had simply moved on with his life, leaving me behind without a backward glance. The final blow, the act that severed the last fragile thread between us, came unexpectedly, brutally. I was at Margot's house, sharing a cup of tea, when I decided, in a moment of desperate hope, to call him from her phone. I convinced myself that maybe he had lost my number, that it was all a simple misunderstanding, a glitch in communication. But when he picked up Margot's phone and heard my voice on the other end of the line, there was a long, pregnant pause. And then the line went dead. Disconnected, blocked. Not just ignored, not just unanswered calls, but an active, deliberate act of shutting me out entirely. I sat there in Margot's quiet kitchen, the phone heavy in my lap, feeling the last, tenuous connection between us snap with a painful finality. There was no confrontation, no shouting match, no dramatic, tearful goodbye. Just silence, and the slow, devastating realization that I had handed over everything, my life savings, my deep-seated trust, my carefully nurtured dreams for the future, to someone who had absolutely no intention of ever looking back, of ever acknowledging the depth of my sacrifice. I didn't tell anyone right away. The shame was too profound, the pain too raw. I couldn't bear the thought of the pitying looks, the whispered judgments from those who might have warned me, who might have seen what I was too blinded by love to perceive. Instead, I withdrew from the world, retreating inward. I stopped going to the library where I used to volunteer, stopped baking the simple treats that had once brought me comfort, stopped reaching out to the few friends who still occasionally checked in. I became a ghost in my own life, drifting through the days, haunted by the persistent memory of a son who had once run into my arms, his small voice whispering, "I'll always take care of you, Mom." I didn't leave Brian's life. He pushed me out, so gently, so cleanly, that it took months for the truth to fully penetrate the layers of my denial. I was standing outside the door, alone, and I knew, with a crushing certainty, that it was never, ever going to open again. Rock bottom didn't arrive as a sudden, catastrophic crash, a single defining moment of despair. It was a slow, grinding erosion, a relentless wearing away of my spirit and my will, until I looked in the mirror and no longer recognized the woman staring back. It began subtly, in small, almost invisible ways that accumulated over time. Bills that had once felt manageable now loomed like dark, menacing shadows over my life. The heater in the old house chose November to finally give out, right as the nights turned sharp, unforgiving, and bitterly cold. I bundled myself in layers of blankets, or wrapping myself tightly, convincing myself that it wasn't really that cold, that it certainly wasn't worth dipping into the meager remains of my savings to fix. The grocery list, once a source of careful budgeting, grew shorter and shorter each week, essential items prioritized over everything else. I started clipping coupons again, just as I had done when Brian was a child. Not out of choice this time, but out of sheer necessity. It was a matter of survival. Friends called, their voices filled with genuine concern. But I found reasons, flimsy and transparent even to myself, not to answer. I couldn't bear the thought of having to explain, of articulating the depth of my pain and humiliation, or, worse, of lying, of pretending that everything was fine when my world had shattered. And beneath the surface of my excuses lay a deeper reason I couldn't bear the kindness in their voices, a kindness I knew, deep down, I didn't deserve because I blamed myself, fiercely and relentlessly, for having been so foolish, so blind. I stopped baking. The kitchen, which had once been filled with the comforting aroma of fresh bread and pies cooling on the counter, now sat silent, sterile, a monument to a happier past. The television flickered in the evenings, its canned laughter and manufactured drama failing to penetrate the thick fog of my despair. I spent more hours than I care to admit sitting by the window, staring out at a world that continued to spin forward, a world that no longer felt like mine, a world from which I felt utterly detached. One afternoon, a stark white envelope arrived in the mail from the power company, stamped with a menacing declaration in bright red ink, "Final notice." I held the letter in my hands, my mind numb, unable to fully process the implications. How had it come to this? How had a lifetime of hard work, careful saving, and meticulous planning crumbled into this terrifying reality? This fear over keeping the lights on, over the most basic necessities. A desperate urge surged within me. I wanted to call Brian. I wanted to scream down the phone, to demand answers, to force him to see, truly see, the devastating consequences of his actions, what he had done to me. But I didn't. I already knew, with a chilling certainty, what would happen: either the cold, empty silence of an unanswered call or the immediate, brutal click of the blocked line. He had made his choice long ago, definitively and irrevocably. And somewhere deep inside, in the quiet, honest space of my soul, I knew I had made mine too, long before the money ever left my account. I had chosen to believe in him, in his promises, in the boy he once was, over believing in myself, over protecting my own vulnerability. One evening, as the biting chill of winter settled hard over the neighborhood, I sat in the living room with only the faint, flickering light of an old lamp for illumination. The heater remained broken. I wore 3 sweaters and 2 pairs of socks, but the cold seemed to seep into my very bones, a physical reflection of the internal ice that had formed around my heart. I watched my own breath cloud the air in front of me, a visible testament to the biting cold, and a single desolate thought formed in my mind. This is it. This is how you disappear. The house, which had once pulsed with the vibrant energy of Brian's footsteps, his laughter, the distant thrum of his music blaring upstairs, was now just wood and drywall, filled with empty echoes, haunted by the ghosts of happier times, the memories of what we had lost, of the life we had once shared, hurt more, far more, than the physical cold that permeated the air. The absolute lowest point arrived not with a dramatic crash or a sudden moment of revelation, but with a whisper, a quiet, insidious thought that stole into my mind in the deepest hours of the night. It was a Thursday night, one like so many others, cold, silent, heavy with the oppressive weight of disappointment and despair. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the faint lamplight illuminating a single, lonely slice of stale bread on a plate. A meager offering in the face of my overwhelming emptiness, when the thought, horrifying and seductive in its finality, whispered maybe no one would even notice if I simply disappeared. Not Brian. Certainly not anymore. He had already proven that my absence meant nothing to him. I recoiled from the thought, horrified at the depth of my despair, at the darkness that had encroached upon my soul. But it clung to me, wrapping around my ribs like a slow, suffocating vine, squeezing the last vestiges of hope from my chest. That night, I crawled into bed, fully dressed, too exhausted to change, too numb to summon the energy to even cry. I lay there in the dark, the harsh glare of the streetlights casting long, thin shadows across the ceiling, painting the room with a desolate geometry. The old clock in the hallway ticked louder with each passing second, its relentless rhythm a cruel reminder that another day was ending, exactly as the last one had in silence, in isolation, in pain. I don't know how long I lay awake. Hours. Maybe. The world outside continued its indifferent progress, unaware of the silent struggle unfolding within these walls. Somewhere. Brian was probably laughing with friends, making plans, confidently dreaming of his next big move. A life built on the foundation I had so painstakingly provided. A life that no longer included me. I was a closed chapter in his story, a forgotten paragraph he had simply skipped over. Lying there, in the profound stillness of that dark room, I finally, truly understood that the boundless love I had poured so freely, so fiercely, so unconditionally into Brian had ultimately left me empty, drained, and utterly alone. I had spent decades building a future, sacrificing my own needs and desires for someone who no longer even saw me, who had erased me from his narrative. I was cold. I was alone. I was tired, bone deep, tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. And for the first time in my life, in the face of this overwhelming desolation, I didn't know if I possessed the strength, the will, to keep believing that things could, or ever would, get better. That was rock bottom. Not the broken heater, not the empty bank account, not even the crushing silence from my only child. Rock bottom was the terrifying moment I realized that I had lost not just my savings, not just my financial security, but a fundamental part of myself, the part that still, despite everything, stubbornly believed that love, in its pure and unconditional form, was always enough. It happened on a night like so many others that had preceded it, cold, profoundly silent, heavy with the accumulated weight of disappointment and grief. Sleep eluded me once again. The weight of everything, the empty savings account, the stack of unpaid bills looming like threats, the hollow ache of loneliness that resonated through the house, sitting on my chest, like a suffocating stone. I shuffled around the house in my worn slippers, moving with a listless aimlessness, performing small, futile tasks, tidying counters that were already spotless, straightening picture frames on the walls that hadn't been touched in years, seeking some semblance of order in the chaos of my internal world. In the back of the living room closet, buried beneath boxes filled with old Christmas decorations and carefully preserved photo albums, capturing moments of a happier past, I found a weathered accordion file. It was where I kept important documents, the papers that chronicled a lifetime. It had been years since I'd had a reason to look through it. I sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by the ghosts of holidays past, and began thumbing through old paperwork, birth certificates, mortgage papers, tax returns, faded pieces of a life that suddenly felt as though it belonged to someone else, a stranger. Near the back of the file, tucked away, I found it, a simple manila envelope, its flap labeled in Brian's familiar handwriting. A flicker of curiosity, a faint echo of the mother I once was, prompted me to pull it out and open it carefully. Inside were a few sheets of paper, legal documents that I vaguely remembered signing months ago, when Brian had convinced me to help formalize things for his business loan. At the time, I hadn't read them closely. Why would I? I had trusted him implicitly. I had trusted that whatever he needed me to sign was harmless, a mere formality, that he would never, ever do anything that could possibly hurt me. But something about tonight, maybe the pervasive silence that pressed in on me, maybe the bone-deep cold that had settled in the house and in my heart, compelled me to read the fine print for the very first time. My eyes scanned the densely packed page, slowly at first, absorbing the technical jargon and legal language, then faster, my heart beginning to thud in my ears with a sudden, insistent rhythm. Tucked almost innocuously between paragraphs of complex clauses and legal definitions was a singular critical clause, highlighted faintly in yellow, almost as if it had been intended to be overlooked. Borrower agrees to full repayment with interest within 12 months of receipt. Failure to repay may result in legal action. I sat back on my heels, the dusty floorboards cold beneath me, utterly stunned. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. I hadn't just given Brian my savings, a gift born of love and sacrifice. Legally, according to this document bearing his signature, he had borrowed it, and he had signed his name, a legal commitment to the promise of repayment. All this time, I had been living under the crushing weight of shame and helplessness, assuming that I was powerless, that there was no way, absolutely no way, to reclaim what I had lost, that it was simply gone, a painful lesson learned too late. But here it was, unexpectedly revealed in a forgotten folder in a dusty closet. My lifeline, my small, fragile sliver of justice, a path forward I hadn't dared to imagine. At first, I didn't know what to feel. Relief, rage, a fragile sprout of hope. None of these emotions arrived clearly or distinctly. I just sat there, staring at the page, my mind whirring with a sudden rush of possibilities that had previously seemed unattainable. This discovery, this simple piece of paper, didn't erase the deep, searing wound of betrayal. It didn't magically bring back the warmth, the trust, the effortless connection we had once shared. But it gave me something I hadn't felt in months. Perhaps even years. It gave me a choice. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting with a soft creak from the cold floor. I clutched the papers to my chest, holding them as if they were something infinitely precious, something sacred. They weren't just legal documents. They were tangible proof that I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't been entirely foolish for wanting to believe in something better, in someone I loved. For months, I had lived under the suffocating weight of shame, blaming myself, questioning every decision I had made, every instinct I had ignored. But now, for the first time, the truth stood stark and clear before me. Trusting Brian hadn't been the mistake. Trusting him without protecting myself, without acknowledging the potential for disappointment, had been the crucial error. The house remained silent around me. The only sound the steady, rhythmic ticking of the old clock in the hallway, a quiet counterpoint to the sudden storm raging within me. I walked into the kitchen, drawn by an unseen force, and turned on the small lamp over the sink, casting a warm, soft pool of light onto the familiar, worn surface of the table. I laid the papers down, spreading them out, studying them under the gentle glow. They looked so ordinary, so unassuming, just a few sheets of paper and a signature. And yet they represented a quiet power I hadn't realized I still held. a latent strength waiting to be discovered. In the stillness of that kitchen, surrounded by the silent witnesses of my past, the old stove, the familiar cabinets, the ghost of Tom's presence, something profound shifted inside me. Not a roaring fire, not a sudden, overwhelming surge of righteous rage, but a steady, simmering resolve, quiet but undeniably powerful. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't invisible, fading away unnoticed, and I wasn't done. The woman who had spent decades scraping and saving, loving fiercely, and sacrificing without hesitation, wasn't going to vanish quietly into the cold and the dark. I had spent the better part of my life protecting Brian, shielding him from the harsh realities of the world, ensuring his safety and well-being. Maybe, just maybe, it was finally time to protect myself. That night, standing alone in my kitchen, bathed in the soft lamplight, I made a decision. I didn't know precisely what steps I would take, what the road ahead would look like, how difficult or painful it might be. But I knew this. With absolute certainty, I would not let this betrayal define me. I would not let this heartbreak be the final, tragic chapter of my story. The paper sat under the soft pool of light, waiting. And so was I. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I slept through the entire night, a deep, restorative slumber, undisturbed by anxiety or regret. Waking up the next morning, I felt palpably different. It wasn't a dramatic, instantaneous transformation, not a fiery surge of unshakable confidence. It was quieter, deeper, a steady, resonant thrum in my chest, like something fundamental and solid had finally shifted back into its proper place after a long displacement. I stood in the kitchen, holding my customary cup of black coffee, the morning light leaking in through the thin curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For the first time in a long, long while, I wasn't dreading the day stretching out before me. I wasn't sinking under the oppressive weight of helplessness and despair. Instead, I felt rooted, steady, and capable. The papers sat neatly stacked on the kitchen table, exactly where I had left them the night before. I reached out and rested my hand over them, not clutching them desperately as if they might disappear, but touching them with a quiet sense of respect, a recognition of their significance. They weren't just legal documents. They were a tangible reminder, a promise whispered into the silence that my story wasn't over yet. After breakfast, fueled by that newfound sense of quiet purpose, I pulled out a worn notebook from the kitchen drawer, the same one I had used for years to track grocery budgets, list home repairs, and jot down recipes, the mundane details of a life carefully managed. I sat down at the table and began to make a list. Not a list of everything I had lost, the financial ruin, the shattered trust, the broken bond with my son. Instead, I made a list of everything I still possessed, everything that remained my home, small and old, but paid off, a safe harbor. My mind, still sharp and clear, capable of processing and planning, friends like Margot who still cared, their quiet presence a lifeline I hadn't fully appreciated, and now, tangible evidence, a small but undeniably powerful path forward. As I stared at that list, another realization, equally profound, settled upon me. For months, I had been living in a state of perpetual waiting, waiting for Brian to call, to apologize, to somehow magically make things right, to restore what had been broken. Waiting had become a habit, a passive state of being. But what, I asked myself with sudden clarity, had all that waiting given me? Only more loneliness, more pain, more slow, agonizing decay of my spirit. If I wanted anything to change, truly change, it had to start with me. Not with him. Not with anyone else. And so I got dressed, not in my usual uniform of oversized sweaters and worn jeans, the garments of mourning and retreat, but in a crisp blouse and slacks I hadn't worn in months, clothes that felt like putting on a different identity. I brushed my hair, applied a little lipstick, small acts of defiance against the despair that had consumed me, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman who stared back, her face lined with hardship, but her eyes holding a new glint of determination, wasn't a victim. She wasn't invisible. She was still standing. I gathered the documents carefully, sliding them into a clean manila folder, and tucked them under my arm, a small shield against the world. My hands shook slightly as I reached for my car keys. Not from fear this time, but from the unfamiliar rush of adrenaline, the energy that surged through me from finally moving, from finally choosing action over sorrow, purpose over passive waiting. I didn't have a fully formed plan yet, not a detailed map of the journey ahead. I just knew the crucial first step: find out what my rights were, find out what could be done, what justice might look like. Driving into town that morning, I realized how much my world had shrunk over the past year, how confined my life had become. Streets that had once felt intimately familiar now seemed slightly foreign. New shops had popped up, old, beloved ones had disappeared. Life, in all its relentless forward motion, had simply gone on without me. And for the first time, standing on the precipice of taking action, I didn't resent it. I felt a quiet readiness, a timid but firm desire to rejoin it, even if it felt daunting, even if it was scary. I parked outside the small, unassuming law office where Margot's cousin, David Langston, practiced. I hadn't called ahead. I hadn't even told Margot yet. This was something I needed to do for myself, in my own quiet way. I simply walked through the front door, the little bell chiming overhead announcing my arrival, and approached the receptionist's desk. "Hi," I said, my voice surprisingly clear and steady, not betraying the turmoil beneath. "I need to speak to someone about financial fraud." The words tasted strange on my tongue, sharp and real, acknowledging a painful truth. But they didn't feel shameful anymore. They felt right, like speaking a necessary truth into the world. David met with me about an hour later. He was a kind man, professional in his demeanor, but with an underlying current of compassion in his eyes. He listened attentively, and crucially, he didn't treat me like a helpless old woman, lost and confused. I showed him the papers, explained everything that had transpired carefully, chronologically, answering his questions without flinching, stating the painful facts as simply as I could. When I finished speaking, a heavy silence settled in the room. He leaned back in his chair, studying me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke. "You have a case, Mrs. Carter?" he said, his voice calm and measured. "A strong one." Hearing those words, hearing someone else validate my experience, confirming that I hadn't imagined the betrayal, that I had rights, that I mattered, sent a tremor through me. Not fear this time, but something else. Strength. A quiet surge of power. David laid out the options with clarity and precision, formal letters of demand, court filings if necessary, even the possibility of seeking restitution for the emotional and financial damages I had suffered. It wouldn't be easy, he warned gently. It could get messy, potentially ugly. Brian might fight it fiercely. He might say things, make accusations that I wasn't prepared to hear. But for once, the thought didn't paralyze me. I felt prepared, not for a battle against Brian, exactly, but for a battle for myself, for my dignity, for the life I had worked so hard to build. That afternoon, as I signed the first set of documents to officially initiate the legal process, a profound realization settled within me. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I wasn't pursuing legal action to hurt Brian, to punish him for the pain he had inflicted. I was doing it to stand up for the woman who had spent her entire life giving and loving, sacrificing, without asking for much in return. The woman who deserved better. The woman who was finally, quietly, beginning to wake up after a long, dark hibernation. After I left David Langston's office, a strange, unfamiliar calm settled over me. It wasn't relief in the traditional sense, it was a deeper kind of steadiness. Like finally setting your feet on solid ground after drifting adrift at sea for far too long. For the first time in months, I wasn't anxiously waiting on Brian's call. I wasn't compulsively checking my phone, hoping against hope for an apology, a sign of remorse that I knew, in my heart, would never come. I was done waiting. I was moving forward, choosing my own path. But I didn't tell anyone about the legal steps I had taken. Not Margot, not the few friends who still occasionally called to check in, and certainly not Brian. I didn't want sympathy. I didn't want advice that might waver my resolve. I wanted quiet, deliberate action. Unfolding without fanfare, without drama. A private rebuilding of my life. David filed the first official demand letter within a week. It was crisp, professional, and devastating in its simple, legal precision. Repay the loan in full, including accrued interest, within 30 days, or face formal legal action. We sent it via certified mail to the last address we had for Brian, ensuring he would have to sign for it, acknowledging its receipt. I allowed myself a moment to imagine him opening that envelope. The shock on his face, the sudden scramble to figure out how to respond, how to escape the consequences. But I didn't dwell on it. This wasn't about him anymore. It was, finally, irrevocably, about me. Meanwhile, I began making small, deliberate changes in my life, steps towards reclaiming a sense of normalcy and purpose. At first, these changes were almost invisible to anyone but myself, small internal adjustments. But they felt monumental, tectonic shifts in the landscape of my existence. I reorganized the house, decluttering not just the physical space, but the emotional weight that had accumulated. I gave away old things I no longer needed, shedding the past layer by layer, old clothes filled with the ghost of his childhood, dusty knickknacks that no longer held meaning, pieces of furniture that had simply gathered dust. Every bag I dropped off at the local donation center felt like shedding a layer of grief, a quiet release of the sadness that had clung to me. I also took on a few shifts at the local library, a place I had always found solace. They needed help shelving books, organizing materials, running the checkout desk. It wasn't much money, a small supplement to my now precarious finances. But it wasn't about the paycheck. It was about reclaiming a part of myself. The part that believed she still had something valuable to offer the world. A purpose beyond the confines of my home and my heartbreak. And I started a savings jar on my kitchen counter. A small, clear glass jar. Every time I earned a few extra dollars from the library, or found a forgotten coin in a pocket, I dropped it in with a quiet sense of pride. It felt almost laughable in a way. A small glass jar, a few crumpled bills and loose change, compared to the substantial amount I had lost. But it represented something far bigger than money. It represented the beginning of building my life again, brick by careful brick, on my own terms, for myself. I didn't call Brian. I didn't text him. I didn't reach out in any way. I let the silence, the legal process unfolding quietly in the background, do the work. He wasn't used to that. For years, I had been the one who always reached out, who initiated contact, who patched things up after arguments, who called first after periods of distance, who forgave without being asked. But this time, I stayed still. I didn't chase. I didn't beg for his attention or acknowledgement. I simply allowed the natural consequences of his actions to unfold, unhindered by my usual impulse to fix or rescue. A few weeks later, David informed me that Brian had indeed signed for the certified letter, confirming he had received our formal demand. But he hadn't responded within the specified 30 days. That was fine, David said calmly. It was exactly what we expected, and we were already well into preparing the next step, filing a formal lawsuit for repayment. The paperwork was dense, filled with complex legal language I barely understood. But David patiently walked me through every part of it, explaining the process, ensuring I knew exactly what we were doing and why. At night, I would sit at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea, the documents spread out before me. They didn't scare me anymore. Not like the bills had. They empowered me. They were a tangible testament to the quiet strength I had finally found within myself. And the best part? No one else knew the specifics of what was happening. There were no dramatic social media posts, no angry phone calls to mutual friends airing my grievances, no scenes played out in public. It was a silent setup, a quiet, determined campaign of reclaiming my life, step by careful step. There was a strange kind of dignity in it, in choosing not to scream my pain to the world, not to beg for justice or understanding, but to simply build it, quietly and firmly, one action at a time. Beneath the radar, Margot asked me once, gently, if I had heard from Brian. I just smiled. A genuine smile this time, not a forced one. And I said simply, no, but I'm doing fine. And it was the truth. The paralyzing fear that used to gnaw at me at the mere thought of confronting him, of demanding what was owed to me, was gone. In its place was something much stronger, much more stable peace. Because no matter what happened next, whether Brian tried to fight the case, whether he eventually came crawling back with a litany of excuses, I knew deep down that I wouldn't be shaken to my core again. I had already survived the worst part, losing the illusion of who he was, confronting the devastating truth of his betrayal. Now, every day I lived, every small step forward I took, was proof that I could survive the rest, that I was resilient. In the quiet rhythm of those days, filing paperwork, meticulously rebuilding my savings, volunteering at the library surrounded by the comforting presence of books, I realized something powerful. Reclaiming your life doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be messy, filled with public confrontations or dramatic outbursts. It just has to be yours. And my life, slowly but surely, was finally starting to feel like it belonged to me again, not defined by someone else's actions or lack thereof. It didn't happen overnight, this shift, but slowly, surely. I could feel the ground beneath my own feet becoming steadier, firmer, while the ground beneath Brian's, the ground built on deception and borrowed money, felt like it was beginning to crack and crumble. The first truly palpable sign that the balance of power had shifted came a few weeks after the lawsuit was formally filed with the court. I was shelving books at the library, the quiet rhythm of the task a soothing balm, when my phone buzzed with a message from David. I paused, the spine of a novel resting against my palm, a sense of anticipation bubbling within me. His message was brief but carried a different energy this time, a quiet satisfaction that resonated even through text. Brian's attorney reached out. They want to talk settlement. I stood frozen for a moment, not from fear, but from the sheer impact of the words. It finally, truly hit me, he knew. He knew he couldn't outrun this, couldn't simply ignore it away. He knew he was losing control of the narrative, of the situation he had created. And I wasn't chasing after him this time, desperately trying to connect, to plead my case. He was the one scrambling now, reacting to my quiet, determined action. I slipped the book back onto the shelf, adjusted the collar of my cardigan, and calmly resumed my work without replying immediately. The old Evelyn, the one who would have dropped everything, panicked, rushed to respond, to resolve, to fix, was gone. I would answer, but I would do so on my terms, in my own time. Over the next few days, the shifts became even more obvious, more desperate on his part. Brian tried calling my old cell number, the one I had since disconnected, a ghost line, no longer in service. He sent a generic, impersonal email to an address I barely used anymore. A clumsy attempt to bypass David, asking me to talk things out before it gets ugly. The message itself was a predictable mix of flimsy excuses, half-hearted superficial apologies, and vague promises of paying me back when things stabilize. A phrase that felt hollow and manipulative. I didn't answer. For years, Brian had relied on my softness, on my deep-seated need to hold our relationship together, on my willingness to forgive and overlook. But he didn't understand something vital, something I had learned in the long, silent nights of my despair. Silence is a language too, and now, standing firm in my resolve, it was the only language I was willing to speak to him. David handled all communication from that point forward. His responses cool, professional, and utterly unyielding. Each time Brian's side attempted to wiggle out of their obligation, claiming financial hardship, offering ridiculously low partial repayments, suggesting creative solutions that amounted to pennies on the dollar. David responded with quiet firmness, reiterating our position without emotion or threat: full repayment of the loan amount, plus damages, or we proceed directly to trial. No anger, no begging, just the unwavering power of facts and legal truth. It drove Brian crazy. David later told me his lawyer reported escalating frustration and panic. Slowly, inevitably, fragments of information, whispers about Brian, began to drift back to me through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances and small-town gossip. They were small things at first, almost insignificant in isolation. Someone mentioned seeing Brian selling off some of his expensive electronics, the gadgets he had paraded with such casual ease. Another friend remarked that he had quietly closed down his latest business venture, the revolutionary app that was supposed to change the way people invested. A few whispered rumors floated back about him being forced to move out of his luxurious apartment, trading the high-rise views for a smaller, more modest place on the edge of town. I didn't gloat over these tidbits. I didn't celebrate his misfortune or find joy in his struggles. I simply absorbed the information, breathing it in like oxygen after months spent suffocating underwater. For the first time in this long, painful journey, the balance of power was clearly shifting. And it had nothing to do with revenge. It was about justice, about finally, undeniably seeing that I wasn't powerless, that my worth was not dictated by his estimation of me. No matter how many times he had treated me like I was disposable, like my sacrifices were meaningless, I was reclaiming my dignity without lifting a single finger in anger, without resorting to shouting or public scenes. It was a quiet, relentless assertion of truth. One afternoon, as I sat outside on my porch, sipping a cup of tea, basking in the unexpected warmth of the sun, I caught myself smiling. Not because Brian was suffering, but because I wasn't anymore. The raw, debilitating fear and despair that had consumed me were receding. The memories still hurt. The ache of betrayal wasn't something that disappeared overnight with legal victories or the promise of repayment. But the power Brian once held over my happiness, over my emotional well-being, it was gone. I consciously decided to take small joys seriously, again planting vibrant flowers in the front yard, their cheerful colors a defiant splash against the muted tones of the past year. Baking a peach pie just for myself, savoring each sweet, juicy bite. Going to the Sunday market and buying fresh apples and crusty bread without worrying about the cost of every single dollar. Each step forward, no matter how small, built a life that didn't depend on Brian or his approval. A life that was inherently mine. And Brian, he was now the one reacting to my moves, not the other way around. He could no longer casually dismiss me as old-fashioned or out of touch. He could no longer take what he wanted and leave me broken and disregarded in the aftermath. I was no longer the one knocking despairingly at a closed door. He was the one locked outside, watching a door he couldn't open again, no matter how many times he might knock. The power had shifted, not because I had fought him on his terms, the terms of manipulation and control, but because I had learned to fight on mine by standing still, by standing strong, by refusing to be erased. And the quiet strength I had found within myself, the strength that grew in lonely nights and faced unpaid bills, that endured cold mornings and navigated silent afternoons, was stronger than anything he could possibly throw at me now. the foundation of my life was being rebuilt, not from the rubble of what I had lost, but from the solid bedrock of what I had discovered about myself. And this time, it wasn't built for anyone else's approval. It was built with quiet determination and fierce love. For me, the confrontation, when it finally arrived, was notably devoid of loudness or drama. It didn't unfold across a heated lawyer's table or erupt into a screaming match on a front porch for the neighbors to witness. It happened in a quiet, sterile office, under the steady, impersonal hum of fluorescent lights, with a simple, undeniable truth laid bare between us like a map of the wreckage. David had arranged a mediation meeting, a standard part of the legal process, intended as one last opportunity to settle the case before taking it to trial. It was procedure, yes, but it felt like something more profound. It felt like a reckoning, a necessary closure. I sat at the long conference table, the documents related to the case neatly organized in front of me, a tangible record of everything that had transpired. David sat beside me, his presence a calm, professional anchor, his expression unreadable, conveying nothing to the other side. Across the room, the door opened slowly, and Brian walked in. I hadn't seen him in nearly a year, a period of silence that had felt like an eternity. At first glance, he looked superficially the same, confident, polished, the image of a successful young man. But as he walked across the room and sat down across the table from me, I noticed the subtle cracks in the facade, the dark circles under his eyes, the tight, strained set of his jaw, the way he studiously avoided looking directly at me, his gaze darting nervously around the room. For a brief, fleeting moment, the mother in me, the part that had loved and nurtured him unconditionally for a lifetime, wanted to rush to him, to smooth his troubled brow, to tell him everything would somehow be all right, to make the pain disappear. But I stayed perfectly still, rooted to my chair, because some lessons, the most important ones, have to be learned the hard way, through facing the consequences of one's own actions. Brian's lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit, opened the proceedings with a well-rehearsed speech filled with legal platitudes about misunderstandings and unfortunate communication gaps. He attempted to paint Brian as overwhelmed, young, inexperienced, implying that his actions were regrettable mistakes born of youthful naivety rather than malicious intent. I listened, my face impassive, without flinching, letting their words wash over me without penetrating my resolve. When they finished their carefully constructed narrative, David spoke, his voice clear, calm, and utterly devoid of emotion. My client's position remains unchanged. Full repayment of the loan amount, plus damages. There is no negotiation on this point. The room fell into a heavy, expectant silence, punctuated only by the quiet hum of the lights. Finally, Brian spoke, his voice a little rough, hesitant. "Mom," he said, and the word, coming from him after so long, sounded foreign, almost like it belonged to someone else. "You don't have to do this. We're family. We can work this out, just the two of us." I looked at him then, truly looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years, seeing him not through the lens of a mother's blind love, but with clear, steady eyes. The charm, the quick, disarming smiles, the earnest promises, all the tools he had used for years to manipulate my emotions, to win me over. They were still there, flickering just beneath the surface, but they no longer held any power over me. I placed my hands flat on the table, my posture steady and sure, projecting a quiet strength I hadn't known I possessed. "We are family," I said, my voice calm but firm. "And that, Brian, is exactly why this hurts so much. But love doesn't excuse betrayal, and trust doesn't excuse theft." He opened his mouth to argue, to protest, but I gently raised a hand, stopping him before the excuses could tumble out. "You made a choice, Brian," I said, my voice unwavering. "You chose to block my number. You chose to walk away from me. You chose not to fix this when you had the chance." He stared at me, stunned, as if seeing me, the real me, for the very first time, a person he had never truly known. "Now," I continued, my voice holding a quiet power, "I'm making my choice. I'm choosing to stand up for myself, to reclaim what's mine, not with anger or hatred, but simply with truth." David slid a copy of the formal repayment agreement across the table towards Brian. "Sign it, or we proceed to court," he said simply, the legal terms cutting through the emotional undercurrents in the room. For a long moment, Brian just sat there, staring at the paper in front of him, as if it were a loaded weapon, poised to destroy him. His fingers twitched on the polished surface of the table, his face flushed with a mixture of anger, shame, and defeat. He looked at me, perhaps expecting a last-minute softening, a crack in the armor I had so carefully rebuilt, a flicker of the old, endlessly forgiving mother. But there was none. Finally, with a sharp, ragged breath that seemed to deflate him, he grabbed the pen and quickly scribbled his signature across the bottom of the document, angry, bitter, undeniably defeated. It wasn't a victory I celebrated with any sense of triumph or satisfaction. It was sad, profoundly sad, but undeniably necessary. As Brian pushed the signed papers back towards David, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear, "I hope you're happy now." I met his eyes, my gaze steady and clear, holding no trace of the tears that had once flowed so freely because of him. "I'm not happy, Brian," I said, speaking the absolute truth of my heart. "I'm at peace." And that was the most important distinction of all. He left the room without another word, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving the silence of the mediation room in his wake. For a long time after he was gone, I remained seated at that conference table, letting the stillness wash over me, a cleansing tide. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't pleaded. I hadn't begged for love or understanding or remorse. I had simply stood up for myself, quietly and firmly. And it had been enough. David gathered the signed papers and offered me a small, respectful nod. I smiled back, a genuine, unburdened smile, feeling lighter than I had in years. On the drive home, the world outside the car window looked different somehow, clearer, sharper, the colors more vibrant. Not because Brian had been punished, but because I had finally, irrevocably, honored myself, acknowledging my own worth and protecting my own well-being. In the rearview mirror, the sun dipped low towards the horizon, setting the sky ablaze with deep oranges, fiery reds, and bruised purples. It felt fitting. A dramatic, beautiful chapter ending, a new one, filled with the promise of light, beginning. And for the first time in a long, long time. I didn't feel lost. I felt profoundly, blessedly found. Weeks passed after the mediation meeting, and my life began to settle into a different rhythm, one built around small, deliberate joys and a quiet sense of purpose. I wasn't waiting by the phone anymore, my heart leaping with false hope every time it buzzed. I wasn't stalking Brian's social media accounts, searching for some sign of regret or acknowledgement. I had finally, definitively, closed the door on that chapter, locked it, and walked away with my dignity intact, ready to build something new. Then came the final twist, the unexpected moment that sealed the justice I never truly thought I'd see. A coda to a story I believed had reached its end. One afternoon, David called. I answered calmly, expecting another routine update about the repayment schedule. But his voice had a different energy this time, a quiet satisfaction that was palpable even over the phone line. "You're going to want to hear this, Mrs. Carter," he said, his tone tinged with a sense of vindication. Brian hadn't just been forced by the legal process to repay what he owed me. As it turned out, the investigation triggered by my lawsuit, the formal legal action that had forced him to confront the truth, had unearthed something much bigger, a disturbing pattern of behavior. Brian had done the exact same thing, or at least attempted to, with 2 other investors, older clients, people he had seemingly befriended and then convinced to invest significant sums in phantom business ventures that existed only on paper, in his ambitious, deceptive mind. In my heart, I had suspected, in the quiet hours of my despair, that I couldn't possibly be the only one he had manipulated, the only one who had fallen victim to his charm and his relentless ambition. But hearing it confirmed, stated explicitly by David, was still a punch to the gut, a painful validation of the depth of his deception. David explained that authorities, alerted by the irregularities uncovered during our case, were now building a much larger criminal case against Brian, charges of financial misconduct, outright fraud, and even elder exploitation. Serious charges, ones that could leave a permanent, indelible stain on Brian's record, not just legally, but publicly, defining him in the eyes of the world. For a long moment, I sat in silence, processing the implications of what David was telling me. I hadn't set out to ruin Brian's life. My only goal had been to reclaim what was mine, to stand up for the part of me that he had believed was too easy to silence, too insignificant to matter. But his choices, all of them, the web of deceit he had spun, had finally, inevitably, caught up with him. He hadn't just stolen from me. He had built a life around taking, manipulating, and disregarding others. And now, that fragile, dishonest structure was crumbling around him. Weeks later, the story surfaced in the local news outlets. A small blurb at first, buried deep within the business section. Then bigger, more prominent stories detailing the allegations. Local entrepreneur faces fraud allegations. Multiple victims come forward in investment scam. I saw Brian's photo once, scrolling past on a news website. Not the polished, smiling image he cultivated, but a different one. His usual cocky grin was replaced by a hollow, utterly exhausted stare, the weight of his actions finally visible on his face. A mugshot followed not long after, stark and unforgiving. public humiliation, legal consequences, real accountability for his actions. I thought, foolishly perhaps, that seeing it unfold would make me feel triumphant. I thought it might spark a flicker of satisfaction, a sense of vindication for the pain he had caused. But it didn't. Instead, I felt a deep, quiet sadness settle over me. Not because Brian didn't deserve to face the truth of his actions, to be held accountable, but because I had once loved him with a kind of blind, unshakable faith, a boundless belief in his inherent goodness, and he had squandered it all, not just with me, but with anyone who had ever tried to believe in him, to support his dreams. There was a final court hearing regarding financial restitution, a formal procedure to ensure the victims were repaid. I wasn't legally required to attend, but I chose to, not for revenge, but for closure, for a final, necessary acknowledgement of what had happened. Brian sat at the defense table, his shoulders slumped, his once perfect suit looking wrinkled and ill-fitting, a symbol of his diminished state. He didn't look at me once during the proceedings, not when the judge spoke sternly about the betrayal of trust inherent in his crimes, not when the details of the restitution he owed, not just to me, but to the other victims he had deceived, were laid out in cold, financial terms. When the judge finalized the judgment, confirming the legal outcome, my hand stayed perfectly still in my lap. There was no clapping, no tears, just a quiet, internal acknowledgement of the finality of the moment. Afterward, I stepped outside the courthouse, blinking in the crisp, clean air, the sounds of the city seeming sharper, clearer than they had in months. Reporters stood near the steps, their notebooks ready. But they weren't there for me. No one wanted a quote from the woman who had refused to be broken, who had chosen quiet dignity over public spectacle. And that was perfectly fine by me. I didn't need the world to know the details of what I had survived. I knew. And that, I realized, was enough. Later that evening, sitting by my window with a warm cup of tea, warming my hands against the ceramic, I thought about everything that had unfolded over the past year and a half. The initial, devastating betrayal, the quiet humiliation, the cold nights and empty days spent adrift in despair, the small, hesitant steps back towards life, the silent setup of legal action, the steady, unstoppable reclaiming of my own worth. Justice had come, but not in the way I had once imagined it would, not as a grand, sweeping victory shouted from the rooftops, but as a quiet, undeniable truth that simply was. I had won the most important battle of all, the one for my own soul, for my own right to peace and dignity. And Brian, he had to face a world where charm and excuses were no longer enough to mask the consequences of his actions. As the sun slipped behind the horizon, casting long, melancholic shadows across my living room floor, I realized something powerful and true. The person who had been lost, the woman who had once been so full of hope, so willing to believe in the best of others, so quick to forgive, was not broken beyond repair. She had simply evolved, tempered by fire, stronger, wiser, and ultimately, unbreakable. It was almost 6 months after the court ruling, after the legal process had reached its conclusion and Brian's public downfall had faded from the headlines, when he showed up again. I was out in the front yard, tending to my rose bushes, the thorny branches a familiar challenge in my hands. It was early spring, the air carrying that fresh, earthy scent of new beginnings, a promise of life renewing itself. I had just snipped a particularly thorny branch when I heard the distinct crunch of tires on the gravel of the driveway. I turned slowly and saw a familiar car pulling in, a car I hadn't seen since the day everything fell apart. Brian stepped out slowly, awkwardly, his movements hesitant, as if he wasn't sure if he had the right to be there, unsure of the reception he might receive. His shoulders sagged beneath a thin jacket that looked a size too big for him, a symbol of how much he seemed to have diminished. He wasn't the polished, confident young man who had once sauntered into my kitchen with grand plans and even bigger promises. He looked smaller now, visibly worn down, the weight of his consequences etched on his face. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I wiped my gardening gloves on my jeans, watching him, waiting. My heart beat steadily in my chest, not racing with anger, not fluttering with the desperate, fragile hope of reconciliation. Just a steady, calm rhythm. I realized, in that moment, that I had been bracing myself for this encounter without even consciously knowing it. Finally, he took a few hesitant steps forward, closing the small distance between us. "Mom," he started, his voice low and a little rough, cracking slightly on the word, as if he hadn't used it in a long time. "Can we talk?" I considered it, standing there amidst the thorny roses. I had every right, every justification, to turn him away, to protect the hard-won peace I had fought so fiercely to reclaim. But something inside me, something older, deeper, wiser than anger, a remnant of the boundless love that had defined my life, nudged me towards compassion. "You can come in for tea," I said simply, my voice calm, devoid of accusation or overt emotion. But that's all. Inside, the house felt different, welcoming. It smelled faintly of cinnamon and fresh laundry, the comforting sense of home. I led him to the kitchen, the heart of the house, and put the kettle on the stove, moving with the easy, unhurried rhythm of a woman who no longer needed anyone else's approval or validation. Brian sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had once signed away my retirement savings with a heart full of hopeful expectation. He fidgeted with the corner of a placemat, his gaze darting nervously around the room, as if trying to memorize every detail, every object that had once been so familiar. When the tea was ready, I poured 2 cups, placed one in front of him, and sat down across the table. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle steam curling up between us, creating a soft, ephemeral barrier. "I messed up," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper, the words heavy with what sounded like genuine contrition. "I know I hurt you, Mom. I know I betrayed everything you gave me, everything you believed in. I didn't rush to fill the silence, didn't offer words of comfort or reassurance. I let him sit in it, let him feel the full weight of his own words, the acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. I lost everything," he continued, his voice gaining a little momentum, a confession tumbling out. "The businesses, the friends, even the apartment. I didn't just hurt you. I destroyed myself too." I nodded slightly, acknowledging his words without rescuing him from the consequences, without offering the easy absolution he might have been hoping for. I'm not here to ask for anything," he added quickly, sensing perhaps the boundary I had set. I don't know. I guess I just needed you to know that I'm sorry. Truly sorry." He looked at me then. Really looked at me. His eyes meeting mine for the first time since he had walked in. And for the first time in a long, long time. There was no arrogance, no bravado, no manipulative charm. Just a tired, broken young man who had finally run out of excuses, who had nothing left to hide behind. I wrapped my hands around my teacup, feeling the simple warmth seep into my palms. A small, comforting sensation. "Thank you for saying that. Brian," I said quietly, my voice soft but steady. "It matters." A flicker of relief, a fragile, fleeting thing, crossed his face. But I continued, my voice holding a quiet clarity, ensuring he understood the new reality. "I need you to understand something, Brian. Saying sorry doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't magically rebuild the trust that was shattered overnight." He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening, the unspoken understanding passing between us. "I forgive you, Brian," I said, and I meant it. A release of the bitterness that had weighed me down for so long. But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, and it's not an invitation to simply walk back into my life as if nothing happened. As if the past year and a half didn't fundamentally change everything. I saw him flinch slightly, a physical reaction to the boundary I had set. But he didn't argue. Maybe, finally, he understood the depth of the damage, the irreversibility of some choices. "I'm building something new now," I said, gesturing subtly around the kitchen, the symbol of my quiet rebuilding. "A different life, and if you want to be a part of it one day, it has to be on different terms. Terms that I set." He swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the tabletop, and nodded again. A silent acceptance. We sat there for a few more minutes, sipping our tea, letting the silence stretch between us. Not heavy and suffocating this time, but quiet and honest. A space where truth could finally reside. When he stood to leave, he hesitated by the doorway, his hand on the frame, as if expecting a hug, a promise. A crack in the wall I had so carefully rebuilt between us and the past. But I stayed seated at the table, not out of cruelty, not out of lingering anger, but out of a deeper, truer form of love. Real love. I had learned the healthy, self-respecting kind. Knows when to hold on and, more importantly, knows when to let go. He walked out the door without asking for anything more, without a backward glance, leaving the house to me once again. And I let him go. Not with bitterness, not with resentment, but with a profound sense of peace. Because I didn't need him to validate me anymore. I didn't need him to fix what was broken. I had already done that, painstakingly, lovingly, for myself. And as the door clicked shut behind him, sealing the end of that difficult chapter, the house remained full, not of regrets or ghosts of the past, but of strength, of quiet, steady hope, of me. The days that followed Brian's visit passed quietly, settling into a gentle, predictable rhythm, like a slow-moving river smoothing out the jagged stones of past trauma. I returned to my routines mornings at the library, the satisfying feel of books in my hands, afternoons spent in the garden, nurturing new life from the soil, evenings curled up with a good book or preparing a simple, comforting, homemade dinner. Life wasn't flashy or outwardly perfect, but it was mine again, shaped by my own two hands, dictated by my own choices. And that, I realized, was more than enough. I found myself drawn more often to the front porch in the early evenings, sitting in the old rocking chair Tom had built so many years ago. Its worn wood a comforting presence. It creaked gently with every sway, a familiar, soothing sound against the backdrop of chirping crickets and the distant, peaceful hums of the town settling down for the night. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, painting the sky in breathtaking streaks of gold, crimson, and deep purple, I sat there with a cup of tea warming my hands and allowed myself to simply breathe in everything I had survived. It wasn't just the initial betrayal. It wasn't just the loss of the money. It was the slow, agonizing unraveling of the life I had believed in, the future I had built, and the quiet, patient work of weaving something entirely new, something stronger, from the frayed threads of what remained. I thought about Brian, about the innocent, trusting boy he once was, and the complicated, broken man he had become. I had loved him fiercely, sometimes blindly, and that love had undoubtedly left scars, painful reminders of vulnerability, but it had also, paradoxically, taught me the most important lesson of my life. Love, without boundaries, without self-respect, isn't true love. It's a form of self-sacrifice that ultimately diminishes you. And true love, real, healthy love, requires respect, honesty, and care. Not just from the person you love, but, crucially, from yourself. For a long time, I had genuinely believed that being a good mother meant giving everything without question, without pause, prioritizing my child's needs and desires above my own, even to the point of self-neglect. I thought unconditional love meant unconditional tolerance of any behavior, no matter how hurtful. But now I knew better. Loving someone, even your child, doesn't mean abandoning yourself in the process. It doesn't mean handing over your dreams, your dignity, or your financial future without question or protection. It means standing strong, holding your ground, even when it hurts the most. It means holding the line, not out of anger or resentment, but out of deep, unwavering self-respect. As the sun disappeared entirely behind the horizon, the first tentative stars pricked the darkening sky like tiny diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders against the cooling air and smiled softly to myself. The house behind me felt smaller than it once had. Perhaps quieter in the absence of Brian's restless energy. But it was no longer empty. It was full of resilience, full of lessons hard won, full of a quiet, enduring peace. There were still scars, moments when the grief pinched at the edges of my heart. Birthdays missed, holidays spent apart. The faint ache of what could have been if things had gone differently. But there was also, undeniably, pride in having stood up when it mattered most. Pride in having fought not for revenge, but for my own worth. Pride in having painstakingly reclaimed a life that belonged solely to me. I thought about the young woman I had once been, full of vibrant dreams and boundless hope, so willing to give everything for those she loved. I honored her memory. I forgave her youthful idealism. and I honored the woman I had become, wiser, stronger, tempered by experience, less willing to lose herself for anyone else's sake. As the evening deepened and the cool air kissed my cheeks, I realized something simple and yet profoundly powerful survival isn't just about holding on, clinging desperately to what you have. It's about knowing when to let go, when releasing the past is the only way to make space for the future. I had let go of Brian, not the love I still held for the memory of the boy he was, but the desperate need to fix him, to save him, to be the glue holding together a relationship he had chosen, definitively, to break. I had let go of regret, the endless what-ifs and why didn't-I's that used to haunt my sleepless nights, replaying every interaction, searching for where I had gone wrong. I had let go of shame, the cruel, silent judgment I had once turned inward when everything fell apart. And in letting go, in releasing the past, I had made room for new joys, new connections with others who valued me, new beginnings I hadn't dared to imagine before. The stars above me blinked and shimmered, ancient and steady, a silent, cosmic witness. I rocked gently in my chair, the familiar creaking sound blending into the soft symphony of the night. This was my life now, not broken, not perfect, not without its lingering aches, but whole, built not on promises made by others, promises that could be broken, but on promises I had made to myself to stand strong, to love wisely, and to never again forget that my own heart, my own worth, my own well-being mattered too. I sipped the last of my tea, savoring its warmth, feeling the quiet strength radiating from within. Tomorrow would come, bringing with it its small routines and quiet triumphs. Tomorrow would come, and I would meet it not with fear or dread, but with open arms, because I was still here, still standing, still choosing myself every single day. And that, I finally understood, was the greatest victory of all.